So if people challenge her on things, she's kind of like, not quite sure. We've also seen it where aides will run into the shot and whisper in her ear like an answer. We've seen calls cut off, not because the caller was getting irate or anything, but just like the question got complicated and they just like, hang up on the person, because then that way she won't get flustered too much. So she has been basically a rubber stamp for the extreme conservative agenda and definitely for the Trump agenda. And people in her district, even though there is that Republican trend, I think a lot of people realize that she's kind of like a cardboard cutout holdover, in place of a representative, that we just need better representation. So we do have Ben McAdams. He's the mayor of Salt Lake County, and he's very popular there. And he has actually thrown his hat in the ring to run, in addition to Tom Taylor, and we've got, I think it's Darlene McDonald. So there's a few people running, but he is the big name in the race and is actually the most popular polling Democrat in the state.
Well, I think we'll all be very excited if if Utah manages to flip a congressional district. So what effect has gerrymandering had on the state?
So Utah actually used to have a Democratic House seat. It was actually Mia Love's district. And what they did is there's actually like Salt Lake County is actually a very, very Democratic county. The further you get into Salt Lake, the more concentrated it is and the more progressive people are. And so a few years ago, they decided, hey, we don't want to have that Democratic seat. And they redrew the districts so that the county of Salt Lake was split between all of the other districts, which are more rural areas. And so it diluted the vote enough that now we only have Republican representation.
What does the state house look like? Is that a similar gerrymander for the Republican?
Yes. So obviously there would be a great number, of Republican seats anyways, just based on the overall, rate of Republicans in the state. But they also gerrymander their House and Senate districts as well. So basically it's just the effect is exaggerated. So we would pick up Democratic seats if this anti-gerrymandering initiatives comes into play, because we should have had more Democratic representation.
So interesting that we've done a couple of these state-by-state politics segments recently, and gerrymandering has been the one issue that's come up in all of them. It seems to be a really serious problem in a lot of states, particularly Republican gerrymandering. Yeah, I'm really interested to hear that it's a problem in Utah as well. I wouldn't have known that.
Yeah, and if you do research on, the red map strategy, that kind of goes into the history of this Republican agenda over the last 10 years to gerrymander all legislatures, because they decided, if we win all these down ballot races, we'll have much, much more power instead of just focusing on the national races. But yeah, it's been an issue in Utah, and they look each time. Every time they can redraw the districts, they look at the last elections and think, okay, can we squeeze a few more Republican wins in here? So I think better boundaries. By the way, it polls very well in the public, even though, it's a conservative state. The majority of people feel like, we should draw our boundaries fairly, because even though we're Republicans, if we don't win fairly, what does it matter? And so there's widespread support for redrawing the districts.
So the initiative that you are trying to get on the ballot for anti-gerrymandering, what would that look like? How would the congressional districts be drawn then?
So basically it would form an independent commission. So you'd have an equal amount of Republicans and Democrats. So if one of those groups just drew an incredibly biased map, the other group, could veto that. In addition, if for some reason the Green Party or the Constitution Party or something, if they got a certain percentage of the votes at this point, which they're not getting right now, they're not getting a high percentage. Once they hit a certain bar of votes in the state, they would also be added to that group so that they can have a voice. But right now it's kind of a moot point. But yeah, so it would be equal amounts of Republicans and Democrats, and that kind of makes it fair, because they can't proceed unless the districts are fair.
So is there anything else that you want to make sure our listeners know about Utah?
Well, I think we're seeing a lot of activism here, and I know when I first started Indivisible, I was talking to a lot of people who are progressive, and they told me, really, what's the point? I mean, this is such a conservative state. It doesn't matter that I vote in elections and things like that. Like, nothing's going to change. And then we went to work, and we saw lots of progressive people come out and be heard. We had the Jason Chaffetz Town Hall, and we're already making a lot of change in the state. And so I started to see people change their attitudes. And I think sometimes that's what it's all about, just giving people hope and helping people come out, sign petitions, and come out to elections. And there's more progressive people in the state than we realize. And just keep on holding out hope and come out and make your voice be heard.
Well, that was great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm ready to move to Utah and fight for the fight with Indivisible.
Well, that's what we need, right? We need more progressive people who are willing to, work with our state and stand up and be counted, even though it can seem depressing sometimes. We need to infiltrate.
I love it.
Well, I think that's great for all of our listeners to remember. We have listeners in lots of red states.
Yeah.
And not just listeners in Democratic strongholds. We have lots of listeners in very red areas. So it's good for them to hear your clarion call and remember that there are other progressives and that they need to band together.
Absolutely. Bloom where you're planted.
All right. Well, thank you, Courtney.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
Utah, people working together. Utah, what a great place to be. Blessed from heaven above. It's a land that we love. This is the place.
Our guest tonight is Tom Taylor, who is running for Utah's 4th Congressional District. Welcome, Tom.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being with us. Could you tell us a little bit about the 4th Congressional District?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in this district, and I've been kind of obsessed with it ever since it was created in 2012. So that's when it was firstly created, and it's mostly because I grew up in the area. I went to public school in the area. And not only that, but because of how the districts were drawn here, it was the closest district to being flipped. So, Utah has a serious gerrymandering problem. It's ground zero for the practice of what's called cracking, and that's where you take a bunch of like-minded people and you break them up into different groups. So Salt Lake City is kind of the liberal hub of Utah, and it's been broken up into 3 separate districts, with the 4th district, with another district being out of Park City, which is also kind of a liberal area. That's where the Sundance Film Festival is held, for instance. And so basically what happens here is in Utah, Democrats usually get about 30% of the vote, but we have 0 representation on the federal stage. The 4th district, when it was first created, was the closest to being flipped, and so I followed it very closely. And actually, the first race that was run in it in 2012, a Democrat actually won. He won by about 700 votes. It was very close. And that was, his name was Jim Matheson. Jim Matheson decided to retire at the end of that term. And in 2014 and 2016, we had a candidate named Doug Owens that ran in this race. And the first time he ran, he lost by about 7,000 votes. And then that margin actually increased to about 12.5% in the 2016 race. And so right now, I'm focused on just trying to get the seat flipped. In fact, this district has been chosen as one of Swing Left's district, and Swing Left is just a group that is targeting districts that are close, that can easily flip blue, and having people from other districts that are either solidly red or solidly blue to come in and devote resources, whether it's volunteer efforts for research, whether it's knocking doors or making phone calls or donating money. They just want to make sure that these districts flip so that Democrats can take the House back in 2018.
So, what are the residents of the 4th District like? It sounds like it's probably a pretty big district. There's only 4 congressional districts in the whole state of Utah, right?
Right. Each district has about 700,000 people in them. And this district is incredibly young. The median age is only 31 in this district. There's a lot of millennials here, a lot of young families. It encompasses, as far as the districts go in Utah, it has the most number of minority voters. They tend to be Hispanic or Latino heritage here in this area. It has a lot of working class voters, but it also encompasses some parts of a growing tech sector here in Utah. There's a term that's being tossed around here called the Silicon Slopes, and it's because a lot of big tech companies have moved into the Lehigh area, which is a little bit south of Salt Lake City. Companies like Microsoft, Adobe, and Intel have moved in here. And so there's kind of this divide between working class Americans and then also high income tech jobs in the area too.
And so, what do you think the issues are that those voters are particularly focused on, especially if they're younger and maybe more tech savvy voters?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think, it's been my theory and for a long time now that the way to win in this particular district is to actually stand up for a more progressive platform. And it's because of this age divide that we see here. One thing that I note to people that in 2014, if registered Democrats came out to vote in this district, Democrats would have won that seat. Now, this is different than other places because here in Utah, registered Democrats are only 13% of the voting populace. So they're 13, but so this needs some explanation because it's not totally like this. Republicans are about 40 to 45%. Democrats are 13%, and the rest are unaffiliated or independent. Now, one of the reasons this is if you want to vote in the Republican primary, you need to be registered as a Republican. The party has set that up as one of their rules. However, if you want to vote in the Democratic primary, you can be registered anything. You can even be a registered Republican if you want to vote in the Democratic primary. So there's this huge incentive to register as a Republican and no incentive to register as anything else. So when I talk about this small group of Democrats of 13%, these are the people that when they registered to vote, they checked a box next to their voter registration saying, I want to be a Democrat. They're making a public declaration of how they are going to vote. It's the only thing they're doing. They don't get any other benefit out of it other than just making a public declaration of that. So when I talk about registered Democrats voting here, I'm talking only about that 13%. And so what that tells me is that the candidates that aren't standing up for anything bold, that aren't giving us a vision for the future, that don't inspire people, it causes the base not to come out, and then the people that vote Republican consistently from election to election just end up winning. And so the way I see it is we have a bunch of independents here that vote Democratic, especially in the CD4 district, but we're not getting the base out to vote. So I've made my whole platform around this in trying to inspire the base. It starts with Medicare for all, or like a single payer healthcare system, doing some serious work on climate change, and in particularly air quality, and I'll talk about that in a bit. And then also doing something about regular corruption, like ending, having some kind of campaign finance reform, trying to get money out of politics, and ending gerrymandering, which is a real problem here in this state. Now, going back to air quality, the reason I bring this up is Salt Lake City has this different thing called the winter inversion. And what that is, it's an environmental effect where the air gets trapped in a bowl of the landscape. So we have mountains that surround Salt Lake City. And in the winter, when the air gets cold, it traps the pollution down at ground level and doesn't allow it to escape over the top. Because of this, we have serious air quality issues here in Salt Lake City. In fact, the American Lung Association